Friends, thank you very much for joining us once again. If you're new to our discussions, a very warm welcome to you. Just a reminder at the very beginning that there's three things you can do. If you have enjoyed this, click the like button. That really helps us. Subscribe so you don't miss future ones, and you click on the share button. It copies a link and you can paste that elsewhere. We like it when people do that, don't we, James?
We do. It's very great help to get. Yes, absolutely, great help to get the word out on the social media and amongst your friends. In your local, amongst your local ministers or lay preachers or whoever. Yeah.
And who knows, this video actually might have some global reach, mightn't it?
It might. I think today, but I noticed that our last video has reached to Tasmania. Wow. So we were in Guernsey and New Zealand last week and Tasmania this week. So next week, the South Pole.
Driving away all those Tasmanian devils.
Indeed, yeah. So boom, boom.
Now, we're in Trinity 2, second Sunday of the Trinity season.
Yes.
Is that right? Yes, it is. That's right.
It is, yeah.
And so what's our reading this week, James?
So we're in the back end of Luke 9 this week. So Luke 9, 51 to 62. Yeah.
Now, one thing that really struck me about this passage, it was interesting that we've jumped a little bit, haven't we? Because obviously the passage just before this was, well, there are several bits in the chapter before this, but of course part of that is the transfiguration. I think
it was, but that was some weeks ago.
But we dealt with that lots of weeks ago.
Yeah,
and last week we were quite a way back in chapter 8.
Yeah,
and that was the Gerasene demoniac. And it was interesting that we noticed then last week that the story as Luke had it there was quite unusual in being like a Lucan gloss on the Marker narrative. So it wasn't that different from the Marker narrative, although some of the terms had particular significance. But here it seems we are in a distinctively kind of Lucan feel, aren't we?
Yeah, it just definitely feels that. And of course, I think particularly because we have these words about the journey to Jerusalem. And of course, the journey in Luke is a really important part of the way Luke tells the story of Jesus. A key part of the metaphor, I think, of discipleship, really. And this is when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Is a key turning point in the gospel narrative.
It is. Now, before we even get onto that, there's actually some really distinctively Lucan language here as well, isn't there? Which is actually disguised in quite a number of English translations.
Yes.
So the days drew near. I just thought, okay, fine, the days are drawing near. This is a little bit like the Johannine language about the hour has not yet come. But in fact, it's actually rather different language, isn't it? It's about the days being fulfilled.
Yeah, the Greek word here is the root of it is the word for fulfill, and it much more. And I think a much bigger perspective is in view in that sense than just the days drawing near. Maybe this is the fulfillment of all God's purposes throughout the scriptures, but it's certainly the fulfillment for Jesus's ministry and mission. So
and that does connect back again right back to the Benedictus of Zechariah, where he's talking about as God promised of old that he would raise up a horn for salvation. I was also really struck by this language of the days being fulfilled for him to be taken up. Which I think I have to read as saying this is about, as we've discussed before, it's about not simply crucifixion, resurrection, but all the way to the ascension. So actually Jesus' exaltation at the right hand of the Father, from which then he pours out the Spirit.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that Luke is pointing us to that exaltation of Jesus as the goal, as it were? It's from which everything flows, the Spirit comes, the church is empowered, the world is transformed. Rather than I suppose in John it's the cross, it's the very much the emphasis there, and other places you would see it as the resurrection. But actually, really good just to notice that taken up word.
And again, you then get taken up language with the journey language, and I think again there's a connection with distinctive Lucan language about the transfiguration, because only in Luke does Jesus meet with Moses and Elijah, and they talk about his exodus that he's about to happen. So again, it's connecting back. Fascinating that Luke, writing to a Gentile as well as Jewish audience, is making those connections back with the story of Israel. So you've got quite a strong exodus motif. So there's the journey, and it's a journey to the promised land, which in Luke's case is, as you say, Jesus ascended to the Father. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we may make some points about this later on, but I actually think the second half of this passage also has something to say about the journey and the Exodus and the way you journey with Jesus. So it'll be interesting to explore that.
Okay. Well, I don't think I picked that up, so I'll be interested to hear your comments then.
Yeah,
something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's some other really fascinating language here. So even again, even before we get fully into the journey motif, it was again something that you just have to look at quite carefully. This language of face. Again, it's a little bit disguised in English translations, isn't it?
Really is, isn't it? Yeah.
He sets his face to go to Jerusalem, but then he sends messengers before his face, which again, in most English translations just says his messengers ahead of him. And again, another really intriguing thing, I hadn't noticed this here before, but it's also true of John the Baptist. When John the Baptist sends messengers to Jesus to say, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect another? The gospel writers use the word angelos, which we would normally translate as angel, but here is a messenger. And again, Jesus sends angeloi, messengers ahead of him, which is just worth bearing in mind, that the word angelos isn't necessarily
just a supernatural being.
messenger.
Interesting that. And I think this language of face that you point out, I mean, I notice in the new RSV, you get a couple of they do translate it as face a couple of times, but the NIV, it's kind of relentlessly obscured actually. So you don't make any of those connections, and that's a shame, because it's right there in the Greek, as you point out. Yeah,
it is. But of course, this is the paradox or the challenge of all translation. That do you stick with the words, which you end up getting slightly rigid and slightly odd language, or do you actually try and translate it into a equivalent metaphor?
And of course, the problem with that is if you translate it into equivalent metaphor on a sort of one occurrence by occurrence basis, then you lose the thematic bit that flows through, and that, of course, replicating the thematic thing would be very difficult in a translation if you weren't doing a sort of one-on-one all the time consistent.
Just sticking with the face for a minute. Well, interesting that the messengers go ahead who went and entered the village of Samaritans to make preparations for him. Now, we don't get this happening so much in the other gospels, but again, this seems to fit with the pattern before and after, because Jesus has already said to the 12, he sent them ahead of him to all the places he intended to go and commission them. And we take that as a kind of paradigm of mission. And then, of course, we get uniquely in Luke, we get the repetition of this. So he appointed the 72, sent them on ahead of him. And then immediately next chapter, next but one sort of pericope, as it were. So we've got this threefold pattern. And I don't know if that's sort of significant, or is it distinctively Lucan, or are we getting an insight into Jesus's approach to ministry and mission?
Isn't it? It is really interesting, because it means that in our own day, where Jesus is no longer, as it were, incarnate with us, it does mean that we are the ones who are, in a sense, taking the presence of Jesus to that place, and we're making it ready for him, and that's perhaps a much higher calling than we sometimes articulate in the church, where we say something like, God's already at work out there, we're just going along, and we'll discover what God's doing and when we get there. But actually, that, if you think about it, I mean, that's valuing us less than this passage values the messengers of Jesus.
It seems, I think people are reluctant to do that. We're reluctant to do that because it seems very immodest to say,
exactly.
Hey, I'm here now, and I'm the presence of God for you.
Exactly. That's not going to go down well, is it?
It's not, but it is in tune with language we find elsewhere in the Gospels, where, Jesus, particularly in Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says, whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. And if anyone gives a cup of cold water to you because you're one of my disciples, then, they will not lose their reward. So,
and consistent with Paul as well. I mean, Paul, we are the aroma of Christ amongst those who are perishing, as
Yeah, we're doing 2 Corinthians, and we are the body of Christ.
We are the body, exactly. Yeah.
Which we often read in a kind of internal kind of way, saying, oh, well, a body is sort of united in one, and it's all about fellowship. Whereas actually for Paul, it is much more about the body being the presence of Jesus in the world. And that's and I think that flows from his encounter on the Damascus road in Acts 9, where Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? when Saul is persecuting Jesus' followers. So.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, particularly from the evangelical tradition, we're often accused of having either no ecclesiology or a low ecclesiology, but actually this is arguing for a very high ecclesiology. So that's quite interesting, isn't it?
It's the real presence.
It's just, now you start a few hairs running there.
But it's true, isn't it? It's the real presence of Jesus in amongst his people. Localized in the people, not localized in things. So okay, moving swiftly on. Now you mentioned the journey motif here, and that's really significant, because actually we've seen this language of journey before earlier in the gospel, haven't we? And we're actually going to see it again in Acts.
Absolutely. And of course Acts, one of the earliest things, the earliest names for the group of Christians is the way, people who follow the way, and that's the way of Jesus Christ. So it's a very dominant paradigm, really, of what discipleship looks like, that we're on this journey. But the key thing, I think, is it's not so much about where to, but about how you travel. It's actually about the process of traveling, isn't it? So you're traveling with Jesus and being directed and guided by him as you walk, and you are following and walking with. I mean, if you look at the other stories, I mean, the road to Emmaus, I think you mentioned on the vlog, Jesus comes alongside, doesn't he, and walks with the disciples and explains what's going on to them as he does so.
Now, I want to push back on you on that, actually, a little bit, because that would make it sound as though where we're going doesn't matter.
No, I don't mean that. But I do. Okay. I thought you were going to push back on me on that. I think we can mix our metaphors a bit here, because I think that, the goal of the Christian life is to imitate Christ in all things, isn't it? To walk the way of the cross, and
that I may be like him in his sufferings.
That way, exactly. But you can't do that without walking with him, and having him alongside, journeying with us as the one who is the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who's gone before. So
now, go on.
That's I think enough to say.
Here's an interesting, two interesting observations. One is the language of the way actually also has come quite early on, because again, going back to the Benedictus in the end of Luke 1, so that in the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us, to shine on those who live in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. So again, you get language of the way there. But here's the other interesting thing. A number of scholars, I mean, Mark Goodacre has said this a little bit as well, in terms of the language of the Father. And those who would generally see the fourth gospel as being not so much historical, but sort of expositional of Jesus' ministry, explanatory of it. You could actually see Jesus' statement in the Farewell Discourse, I am the way, the truth, and the life, as actually a kind of theological exposition of that. I am the way, so Jesus is the way that we walk in imitation of him, we walk with him. I am the truth, I am the life. So actually Jesus is talking about the fact that he is the one that we're walking towards, but he's also the one that we're walking with. So,
and absolutely. I think that's the interesting paradox, isn't it? Yeah.
One of the questions for me is whether this is language that people around us understand. I was just doing a little broadcast last week on just a quick interview on Radio Nottingham about the whole Rwanda thing. And I did use the phrase, those of us who follow Jesus, if you do follow Jesus, then that affects the whole of your life. And it did occur to me afterwards that the language of following Jesus might sound really strange to the modern ear. I don't know if that's language that people are used to or not.
Yeah, I actually try to use the word follower much more than disciple now, because I think disciple is a word which a lot of people don't really
don't know at all.
It's not used much. But if you say you're a follower of, that kind of begs some important questions at a level that most people could reflect on. But I think you're right. I think a lot of people don't think of Christianity as following Jesus, but believing X, Y, and Z.
Okay.
And that's a different. That's a different thing, and so
perhaps for you to use it more. I mean, my only question is, I think people use the language of follow, like I follow Arsenal, or I follow the cricket, or which is a much more detached kind of idea. So
very detached, very consumerist. Do it when you want to, don't bother. And it's the relentlessness of the call to follow Jesus that we need to be able to communicate.
Yeah. Well, that's the first verse dealt with. Should we move on to the rest of the passage? Oh, actually,
Yeah.
there's the second verse as well. The people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem.
Yes.
The reaction of James and John when they see it, Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven to consume them? It seems slightly absurd. I mean, how could they possibly be that reaction? But actually, there is a context here of violent conflict between Jews and Samaritans.
Yes, and of course, it's over Jerusalem versus Samaria as the place where we should worship, which of course is exposed in John 4 and the woman at the well. And that's why the Samaritans don't want to receive him. If he was setting his face towards Samaria, it would be a different matter. But he's not. It's specifically Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that Jesus rebukes them. Because this is not apparently the way power is to be used. He has power, but he's showing us a different way of using it. And it is not the destruction of Samaritan villages or whatever.
No, indeed.
Of people. And I think it's absolutely fascinating, this, because so often we can, it's very informative for our mission, actually, that
we shouldn't go into our towns and say, if you don't repent and follow Jesus, we're going to call down fire and destroy them.
No. Exactly.
Okay. Well, I think everyone would agree with you there, James.
I think they would, but I think the real point is that we spend often in mission, we spend a lot of time trying to make headway amongst certain subsets or groups of people. And in parish ministry, I've often found this, and you're not making any headway at all. And actually, what you need to do is move on to another group of people. You can reach out over the heads of those people and move on. And sometimes those people can be your own flock, to be honest. But I mean, but actually, truly, we can spend a lot of time on those who are not going to respond. And it seems to me that Jesus is very clear, that he turns and rebukes them, and then they go on to another village.
And
that might be a liberating thought for people.
It is really liberating, and it also, again, it accords exactly with the sending of the 12 and the sending of the 72, where he says, if people won't receive your message, shake the dust off your feet in judgment and move on. So lead them to it. That's interesting. And it is, that does also, it is liberating, because it says that in the end, whether people come to faith or not isn't our job. Our job is to faithfully proclaim. And it's God's job to convict people. I mean, that's a bit of an old truism, but okay, great. Oh, we are making progress here through the passage then. It's interesting though that it's a game in two halves. It's a passage in two halves, isn't it? So you've got this introductory stuff, which is really from 9:51, it's setting the sort of vision towards, right towards chapter 19, when we get to Cloak Sunday, not Palm Sunday, because there are no palms. And again, interesting that Michael Parsons, in his Paideia commentary, which I mentioned before, he does have an eye on these numerological things, numerical compositions, and he notes that actually in this section from chapter 9 to chapter 19, well, a couple of things. Firstly, it is interesting that in this section on discipleship, there is a focus on Jesus' teaching, actually more than his ministry. And it's in this section we get lots of the distinctive Lucan material. So we get the stuff about the Good Samaritan, we get the parables of the lost and the prodigal son and those sort of things. And that struck me as significant. If you're going to follow in the way, this comes back up, I suppose, to that saying in John, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. Actually, to follow the path of discipleship is to attend to the teaching of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
And then Parsons also notes that if we've done the counting correctly, that there are 12 parables either side of this critical parable about the those invited to the wedding feast. So there's an issue around division there. So but if we're going to follow the way, we need to listen to the teaching of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we get to the second half of the passage then, from verse 57 to 62, and again this is interesting because it's very Lucan. So we've got three sayings. Now, again, Parsons reminds us they take the form of krei. That is, useful sayings included to make a point. So they're pretty decontextualized, aren't they?
They do seem to be. And you can imagine Jesus saying them in lots of different contexts, can't you, really? When asked similar questions. Yeah. I mean, the foxes have holes and birds of the air their nests. Yeah.
Yeah, you're raising again that perennial question of whether Jesus said everything once or whether he said things in different occasions.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he taught a lot of people, and the things he taught were really important. The things that were written down in the Gospels are presumably the things that he said most often. So
it is. It's funny that, again, I think you and I were raised in theologically, we were inducted into theology at an era when ideas like the historical reliability of the Gospels was something we were in our corner fighting for against the whole tide of sort of post-Bultmannian scholarship. I think the landscape does feel to me as though it's changed rather a lot. And this is a more respectful view to have. I just think it's when people are saying, oh, look, there's two versions of a story here, and well, that must be because the community, as they pass it on orally, changed the story. Well, hang on a second. What's the basic assumption there? Are you really telling me that Jesus only ever said these things once?
And also you're creating a putative community which you know nothing about, which is just your own invention, really, most of the time. So
unfortunately, there's no actual evidence.
Exactly. But I agree. I think we are in a different era now.
Speculating on things for which there's no actual evidence has never stopped theologians in the past. So
no.
There we go. Now, the three things, two of them are come in the other Gospels, but one of them is unique to Luke, although I've forgotten which one. Is it the last
I can't remember. But they're all these excuses which people make to not walk with Jesus.
It's the third one, which is found in Luke.
Is it?
No one who puts his hand
saying farewell to those at my home. Okay. Let the dead bury their own dead is in others. Yes,
it is. It is. Now, we can look at each of the individual ones, and what is fascinating about these, again, these sayings of Jesus, this is a good lesson for preaching. How memorable are they? Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And they're kind of things that they're good kind of memory verses, aren't they? Because there's no context in, so we can just remember them.
Absolutely. And I'd wager that many Christians do know them by just because they're so pithy.
Leave the dead to bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom. No one who puts his hands to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God, because they've each got a really nice tight structure. There's often repetition. There's taking something literal and turning it into a metaphor. Leave the dead, the actual physical, the spiritual dead, that is those who are not in the kingdom, to bury their own physical dead. So they've got these wonderful sort of twists halfway through. I wish I didn't say this very much when I was teaching preaching in a formal context, but I do say this to people. If you've got a story or a point to make, if you can try and find a way to sum it up in a little pithy aphorism, then
absolutely. And I do this sometimes with a recurring motif throughout the sermon. So you say it maybe 3 or 4 times, maybe even more sometimes, until it just trips off the tongue, and people are practically saying it with you by that time. And that's really.
And if that saying actually develops in its meaning as the sermon goes on, even more.
Even better, But I mean, I thought I think it's really interesting, and I think you use the word. I mean, I was preaching on Sunday, the other Sunday, and actually talked about the inconvenience of God's call on our lives.
Yes.
And actually, whenever, but almost by definition, whenever God calls us, whenever Jesus calls us to do something for Him, or just as a the original calling, as it were, by definition, we're always doing something else. So it's always inconvenient. It's a bit like when my mother used to call me down from my room for dinner or something. I was always absorbed, So we've got to get our heads around the fact that Jesus' call on us is always going to be inconvenient, and that is no excuse. And that's something that I think Christians find really quite difficult, especially one of the interesting things that's happened in the pandemic is there's been as many have pointed out, a massive loss of volunteers in churches. Suddenly being a Christian has become more inconvenient for people and not prepared to put up with the inconvenience. And I think so it's really important that we just simply understand that discipleship is inconvenient. And of course, as you follow the call of Jesus, you get more used to the inconvenience, and it becomes perhaps a little bit easier most of the time. But there is inconvenience. I think the other thing that's really struck me about these excuses is that, and this goes back to your issue about the Exodus and the journey of the people of Israel particularly through the Red Sea and across the Jordan. They all cross over together. And if they didn't cross over together, they get left behind, and the waters would flow over them. So there's really something important here about you've got to come with us now. you can't bury the dead, or you can't say goodbye. You've got to come with us now, because journeying as a Christian is to journey together in the company of the people of God. And we can't have any stragglers, because actually the stragglers get swallowed up. And I thought that's a really interesting challenge from this passage, and particularly associated with that Exodus picture.
I mean, I'm conscious that, as you say all that, that there's a real danger for people taking this as a literal pastoral strategy, as it were. I mean, the hideous thing that Mark Driscoll said was that if you're not on board the bus, you're out the bus, but if you're not on that, you're going to get run over by the bus. But I don't think Jesus is quite saying that.
No, I don't.
I mean, a couple of things come out of that. One is, I think in the blog comment that I made yesterday, I actually do comment on the thing that you mentioned last week quite extensively, which is that there are economic consequences. And it did strike me that one of the things that we probably could say more often is that come and follow Jesus and you're actually going to be worse off. You're going to have less money. You're going to have less leisure time. You're not going to be able to go on such exotic holidays because you're giving your money to the poor or whatever it is. But also the bigger question is, and we miss this all the time in our anxiety to make the gospel seem appealing. Jesus is not afraid to say how difficult it is to follow him. And this is exactly accords with things he said in Matthew right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. He says the way is narrow, and the gate is the gate is narrow, the way is narrow, and the path to life is hard, and few are those who follow it. And we lose something really important when we don't tell people that, because we're not telling them the truth, number one. And actually, I keep coming back to this comparison with when they recruit in the army. When they recruit people for the army, on TV ads is, crikey, you're going to have your head shoved in the mud and you have to climb this. It's going to be really difficult. But actually, the Navy one is really interesting, where they says, born in Preston but made by the Navy. And actually, the call to follow this hard way of life actually is the making of us. It's really interesting, isn't it, that the armed forces really go for that, and they go for the toughness of it, not for the ease of it. But I'm always, the reward at the end is worth the effort. It's absolutely worth it. And I'm always struck by that phrase in the Silver Chair, in the C.S. Lewis Silver Chair. Many fall down, but few return to the sunlit lands. When they're going down into the underworld. Wow. And that seems to be, and it's said relentlessly. So don't underestimate this. That's a cheery note to end on, because our time is up. James, fabulous to chat with you about these things. Folks, thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to like at the bottom and subscribe and pass it on, share it as well. Just coming up on the screen, probably in front of James's face, as I usually do. There's a link to the last video, and also in the middle here, there's a subscribe button. So we hope to see you again in future weeks. Thanks for joining us.